Albertans have spoken at the polls and given Danielle Smith and the United Conservative Party 4 more years. For Rachel Notley and the NDP, the loss comes with some gains as they become the largest ever official opposition in the province.
Oh, many folks wrote us off, even just as recently as last month. But you know what happened? Despite it all, today Albertans chose to move our province forward by re-electing a strong, stable, united Conservative majority government.
We will be welcoming at least 10 more MLAs to our caucus. Who will form part of the largest official opposition this province has ever seen in its history.
The Prime Minister congratulated Smith and the UCP on the election results. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre called it a resounding victory. The UCP won 49 of 87 seats, largely based on a wave of rural support, but lost heavily in urban areas. Smith hammered Notley on her economic performance when she was premier from 2015 to 2019 and painted her as beholden to federal political leaders. Okay, so we want to discuss this more. For that, I've brought Lisa Young into the studio here with me. She's a professor of political science at the University of Calgary, but today she's in Toronto for a conference. So we talked yesterday ahead of this election and ahead of those results that we saw there. This was certainly what pollsters were also projecting, suggesting that there would be a UCP win. Part of what we heard from Danielle Smith in her victory speech there was, "Welcome to another miracle on the prairies." What did you make of the tone and what we heard and the results?
Well, I think it makes sense that she thinks of it as a miracle on the prairies. And that would be because a few months ago, it really seemed improbable that Smith could win an election. Her views had been seen as outside the Alberta mainstream. Polling showed the NDP ahead. So Smith really was able to pull together a remarkable comeback for herself and her party. That said, it certainly is a smaller majority than the party has had in the past, and it really does suggest that Alberta politics are fundamentally different now.
So when you say fundamentally different now, exactly how is that?
Well, for the longest time, Alberta was what political scientists call a single-party dominant electoral system. We'd have free and fair elections, but the same party would always win. And so we would have these 30 or 40-year dynasties of one party forming the government. Then we had the NDP in power for 4 years, and then the UCP came back. But it's pretty clear that Alberta is now a two-party system. There's a competitive NDP, there's a large official opposition, and so I think Alberta politics, conservative parties in Alberta can't assume that they will win in perpetuity.
Let's talk for a moment about what we saw happen in Calgary, because certainly while there was, a victory by the UCP, there were some cabinet ministers who were unseated as well. What did we see happen in that key riding that many people were watching, or the key city with multiple ridings that many people were watching? Yeah,
absolutely. I think the riding you're talking about is Calgary-Acadia, where Tyler Shandro, who was health minister through much of the pandemic, a fairly divisive figure in a variety of ways, lost by just the narrowest margin. I think the last I heard was 12 votes, so I'm sure there'll be a recount there. But it really does speak to the difficulty that the UCP faces in parts of Calgary. Much of the inner city, North Calgary, neighborhoods that have more ethnic diversity in them voted for the NDP. Anywhere close to public institutions like universities and hospitals voted for the NDP. So there's a coalition forming around the NDP, leaving the UCP with rural Alberta and suburban Calgary, particularly in the south.
Now, one of the things that we also discussed leading up to this was that one of the perhaps strongest challenges that Danielle Smith will face is from within her party. Now that she has come out here as the premier again, how will she focus in on the challenges within the party itself?
Yeah. We know that the UCP, as the merger of two parties, hasn't fully gelled, and certainly that resulted in all kinds of trouble for Smith's predecessor, Jason Kenney. So I think what we see here is that much of the party's caucus is from the old Wild Rose Party, and is likely to be highly supportive of Smith as long as she keeps forwarding the issues that matter to that group. But there are going to be a number of Calgary MLAs in that caucus who had narrow wins and who saw some of their colleagues go down. And on the doorsteps, they heard concerns about Danielle Smith and her leadership. So it will be interesting to see how those internal leadership politics play out over the next few months.
You know, in a broader sense, too, I want to ask you what, we're seeing unfold here in Alberta. What does it mean in a broader sense to the rest of the country, specifically when you hear, and Alberta has perhaps been the loudest voice with this message that, we are ignored by the federal government. That is, not something new, but it is sort of taking on a different shape, perhaps. The Sovereignty Act, for example. So I'm wondering, what does that mean for the rest of Canada? Do you think that this will motivate those who see things that same way to perhaps also be more vocal or more stronger about it when we see other provincial elections?
Well, it'll be interesting to see. I think that we're likely to enter into a pretty rocky era of federal-provincial relations. I think we can expect Danielle Smith to link arms with the Premier of Saskatchewan and start really shaking things up in interprovincial relations. And I think a lot of this is going to focus on climate change and efforts that the federal government might make around greenhouse gas emissions. And Saskatchewan and Alberta are lined up, ready to say, no, this is an area of provincial jurisdiction. We have control over natural resources. You can't do anything. And so it's going to be federal-provincial relations, but it's going to be about energy development and climate change. And
just one very final question for you. I want to ask about Rachel Notley. Where does she go from here? Where does the party go from here?
Well, I think that Rachel Notley gets tremendous respect in the party. I think we've heard that. She took the party from being a minor opposition party to government. She's built on that success. I don't think she's going to be pushed out, but I do think that she's likely to reflect on whether it's time for someone else to pick up the reins of the party and be able to run in the next Alberta election without having to answer in that immediate way for some of the economic outcomes that occurred while Notley was Premier earlier.